Good evening and welcome to this talk entitled What's Normal Anyway? It was originally given in December 2020 as the first of a series of talks and workshops as part of the Wales and the World creative writing workshop programme, and it's being re-recorded for YouTube. So I will share my screen with you and we'll get on with it. So this talk is essentially about some of the things that we can learn from a study of disability. And disability has formed a really important part of Welsh experience, though I think this has only recently begun to be explored. The slide that you're looking at now is one project that specifically looked at the Welsh experience of disability in the coalfields in comparison with other coalfields experiences. What we learn from a study of disability affects us all, and disabled and non-disabled. And indeed, we need to revisit these categories themselves and realise that they're not as real or self-explanatory as we might think. So what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about disability and its relationship with so-called normal. And then in the second part of this talk, we're going to look at a short extract from a 1930s novel from South Wales, which study emerged from the Disability and Industrial Society project that you can see on your screen, and use it to think about how disability has been approached in literature and culture. Before we start on disability and to think about what disability means, we need to discuss normal. What is normal? You might be surprised to learn, as I was, that the concept which is so important today, normality, normalcy, average, the norm, abnormal, these are all fairly young ideas. So the word normal, meaning conforming to and not deviating or differing from the common type or the standard, the regular, the usual, that sort of dictionary definition only enters the English language around 1840. And previously, the word norm had meant perpendicular. Norm was a carpenter's square. So normality and normalcy appear in 1849 and 1857, a little while after. And the introduction of those terms coincide with industrialization and mechanization, when we start to discuss average productivity, for instance. And we now take it for granted that we can measure all aspects of our life, from health to diet to time spent on a screen, according to averages or norms. And of course, norms change. We've been living through a profound demonstration of that. The phrase, the new normal, was coined in Canada in response to the pandemic, for example. And we may embrace norms or we may actively reject them. But the concept of normality is, I think, probably familiar to most of us. One way that we define normality is against what is abnormal or different. And disability, in cultural terms, is abnormal. In fact, we almost need to construct a category of disability in order to shore up, to define what we take as normal. So normality needs disability. Leonard Davis puts it, normalcy and disability are part of the same system. Okay, so at this point, we probably need to start unpicking what we mean by the word disability. The social model of disability argues that we need to distinguish between impairment and disability. Impairment is the physical or mental condition, for instance, a sensory impairment such as deafness or a learning difficulty, or having limited physical movement. These are all impairments. But disability is understood as socially constructed. We are disabled by the material or attitudinal conditions in which we live. So a wheelchair user is disabled by stairs, but not by a ramp. Someone with a so-called deformity might be disabled only by the attitudes of those with whom she comes into contact. So disability is not an objective reality. Impairment may be, but disability isn't. Rather, disability is a social process. And it is one that affects us all, whether we consider ourselves disabled or not. So what I want to emphasize here is that disability is an idea. It's constructed in discourse, in media, in literature, in language, in imageries. Disability is also an identity conferred or claimed. And as such, it is totalizing. You're either disabled or you aren't. And being impaired is not always the same as being disabled in your own or other people's perceptions. I can think of many people who have impairments, for example, hearing loss, which I also have, who would not think of themselves disabled. It's not a category that they want to fit into. And I think that was the position that I occupied some years ago, where I was very upfront about having hearing loss and wouldn't hide it. Actually wanted some quite visible hearing aids because it was quite hard to convince people, particularly when I was younger, that I had a hearing loss. But I didn't consider myself as disabled. I do now. So in the coalfield communities that I studied as part of a team of researchers, impairments were not always understood then as disabilities. They could affect your ability to earn, which was disabling, but they might not. If you could still work, in what way were you disabled? And of course, disability goes beyond earning power. But in that particular context, disability or ability could be framed in terms of work. And there were examples of people working, at the coalface with a wooden leg, for example. I want to turn now to think about how disability is constructed in society, associated with otherness. It is often seen in terms of stigma. Stigma is put, I suppose, very simply, deviance from the norm. It is often, the language of stigma is often quite harsh or well, stigmatizing, but it calls attention to abnormality. Rosemary Garland Thompson, who's a prominent disability studies theorist and critic, says that the disabled figure is the paradigm of what culture calls deviant. So we have this idea of stigma, of something that is undesirable and somewhat worrying, frightening, and something that we want to cast out. And it corresponds with or overlaps with ideas of deviance. Dependency is the term that I'm going to come back to, so I will leave that to one side now. But the idea of disability is also that you are not independent, that you are dependent. And disqualification is a really interesting idea. The idea is that one is disqualified from full citizenship, possibly even from full humanity. Disqualification also is not limited to disability. There are lots of ways in which one can be marginalized or not regarded as having full human rights, full and equal status in society. And disability, interestingly, is often used as a sign of other types of inferiority. So, for example, the claim back in kind of early 20th century America, for example, but also back in the 19th century, the claim that people of color, Black people, were less intelligent or even mentally subnormal, or the idea that women of all colors are prone to madness, particularly middle-class white women. You have Black people or women being defined as inferior because they are disabled. So a woman's madness, for example, so-called madness, is stigmatizing because mad people are already stigmatized. They are defined as inferior because they're disabled. So that disability is a thing that disqualifies them as equal citizens, even though that disability is also linked with gender here or with race. So once you start looking at the history of disability, you start to see the way in which disability is invoked in other discourses as a disqualifying or stigmatizing condition, a state of being. And another aspect of that construction of disability as deviant and as undesirable is the idea that there is something lacking in that person, in that body, an insufficiency that needs to be supplied. Something is needed to normalize it. So a prosthesis is added to that body in order to make it look more normal. Interestingly, prosthetics can be extremely useful and they can be enabling. And in fact, in sport now, we're seeing the idea of prosthesis providing a almost superhuman advantage to athletes. And yet some prostheses were developed simply for show, simply to make the body look more normal. And in fact, they were more of a hindrance than a help. So the idea is that the body is lacking something and it needs something to normalize it. Alternatively, the disabled body can be figured in terms of excess, the body breaking its bounds, moving in unexpected ways, in excessive ways. And that idea of excess can also be gendered. It can be related to sexualities. Lesbianism, for example, is often associated with the language of excess. So there is a whole, if you like, sort of constellation of ideas that are associated with disability. And we could also, if we had time, start looking at the way that disability intersects with other types of identity. In fact, the idea of the marked body is quite helpful here. So a marked body is a body that is beyond the norm, if you like, in some way. So disabled bodies are marked. But if we think about the category of gender, the marked body is female, as opposed to the unmarked body of the male. In racial terms, in the category of race, the marked body is non-white. So you could think about this as a distinction between an idealized norm and the unacceptable, stigmatized or other body. So the invisible, the sort of paradigmatic unmarked body is has been sort of characterized by Irving Goffman as a young, married, white, urban, northern, heterosexual Protestant father of college education, fully employed, of good complexion, weight and height, and a recent record in sports. This is, you know, an American model, and yet is probably one that we recognize, and it has economic, sexual, gender, racial, and all sorts of other cultural dimensions to it. So one relationship between normalcy and disability is about defining who has power. These marked bodies are, you can align them with degrees of well, not powerlessness at all, but sort of detractions. The most powerful is the unmarked, invisible body, and the other marked bodies are distanced from power in varying degrees. We can also argue, in fact, that none of us is normal, because normality or the norm is an abstract concept. It's an ideal. The ideal body is associated in European history with the divine body, in fact, and that by definition is out of the reach of humans. And we might, in less religious terms, think about how this ideal invisible body is actually so rare as to be non-existent. Because to be disabled is to be marked as different. a lot of effort has been put into looking normal. And passing is a useful term here. Passing is a term that we might initially associate with racial apartheid. So in segregated societies, looking white enough to pass as a member of the privileged or dominant group had its advantages and its dangers. And as I mentioned earlier on, a lot of prosthetics actually worked by making someone look more normal rather than enabling better functionality. So the term passing has been adopted in disability studies and by disability critics to understand the ways in which people with marked bodies interact, negotiate with the norm. So I said normal was out of reach, but in fact, not only is normal out of reach, disability is far more common, more normal, if you like, than we might think. Some disability scholars and activists use the phrase temporarily able-bodied to describe those with so-called normal or able-bodied. This deliberately undoes the neat binary between able-bodied and disabled and draws attention to a simple fact. That is that most of us will become impaired at some point in our lives. Just the process of aging and becoming more fragile is impairing and disabling. Although interestingly, the elderly tend not to be described as simply as disabled. So the main points really to remember from this talk so far is that first, that normality and disability are part of the same discourse. They are interconnected concepts. And the second is that the two ideas are also contingent, that they, that is, they depend on wider contexts. So what might be considered impairment or disability in any one particular cultural context may not map easily onto another historical period or cultural context. And as you can see on the slide there, it's worth remembering disability is created by wider attitudinal and material environments as impairment interacts with the social world. Okay, so I want to move on now to locate this discussion of disability in Wales and in a particular period of Welsh history. I want to ask the question, so what happens in a place where impairments are already very common, almost normal? For instance, in the South Wales valleys at the height of the coal industry, where accidents were really common, how is disability understood and experienced and treated there? Well, for a start, we find that what constitutes disability is based on whether a man or a woman could still do their jobs, as I mentioned earlier. It wasn't uncommon to find people working even with what we might now describe as a disability. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the disability in the mining areas, and these are work-related disabilities, industrial injuries, so not including congenital impairments, people who were born with various conditions. So for every, you may have heard, maybe more familiar with the idea of the kind of catastrophic explosion in the mine or the flooding, some kind of incident, some catastrophe which results in many deaths. And that, of course, is part of the mining history in Wales and globally. But for every fatal mining accident during the height of the coal industry, 100 non-fatal accidents occurred. So between 1900 and 1950, for example, 100,000 British miners were permanently incapacitated by work-related injury, which actually excludes industrial disease. So that excludes miner's lung pneumoconiosis, there were a large number of people who were, well, the word's permanently incapacitated. And that therefore also excludes people who are impaired but still working and still functioning. I think so. So it was common to see people with various physical impairments, not to mention any other types of invisible disabilities in the coalfields. But the other important way in which the coalfields communities changed the nature of disability was by the way they behaved. If you remember that I said disability was a consequence of the material and attitudinal environment, well, in the coalfields of Wales and in other parts of Britain, the high incidence of accidents eventually led to some pretty amazing changes. You can argue that the solidarity of South Wales workers and workers in other parts of the UK, by banding together in a common cause, they found their own solutions. They established medical aid societies funded by worker contributions. They provided healthcare and prosthetic limbs and trusses and other aids for miners and their families. And the medical aid societies formed the model for the NHS. And now this is not to, so there was this attempt to provide direct practical help through organisation for people with impairments. This is not to say that the medical profession has always served disabled people well, but that's another story. But my point here is to underline the ideas of solidarity and mutualism, the sort of the care of one by all, and attitudes, and to point out that attitudes to disability found in the coalfields are important in this process. That's not to say that the coalfields didn't stigmatize some impairments, but there was a very practical response to disability, and therefore the experience of disability in the coalfields is different to what it might have been elsewhere and what it might have been without the medical aid societies. Disability as an idea and as an emblem, if you like, was also a major theme in campaigns for reform. So disability was being talked about a lot in the politics of the period. The Labour movement used evidence of disabling accidents to force changes in the law to make employers responsible for safety at work, rather than in an earlier period where accidents tended to be blamed on the poor practice of individual workers. And a good example of the interweaving of disability and solidarity narratives can be found in the portrayal of organised marches. Those processions and mass protests which became iconic in the 1930s. So these are both real marches. You can see pictures of actual marches on the slide, but they are also fictionalized or represented in poetry and literature and drama of the period. Here's an example of the way in which in literature and in the sort of journalism of the period, disability and marches come together. So in this just verse from Idris Davis's Gwalia Deserter, we have a representation of one of the hunger marches. And we come to the gates of Londinium, begging with broken hands, boys bath, all together, out of the derelict lands. So all together they come, that sense of the mutualism, which at its most basic means working together for the common good, is here represented by all the boys coming out of the valleys together in order to protest and beg, if you like, at the gates of London. this idea of the broken hands is a recurring image. Broken hands, hands that have worked into deformity and ailment, but also the hand represents the worker, and so the whole of the worker here is presented as broken, as disabled. In the other image on the slide, the toll of industry, you've got this fictional march, and what it's actually trying to do is represent how many disabled workers there are in, and to compare it also with a number of people who are killed by industry. So it's titled The Toll of Industry, and you can't see it probably on this slide, but they're at intervals. There are coffins being carried in what looks like a funeral march, but between them are workers who have been disabled. And right at the back, we're told that there are the families of those who are now destitute or in other ways impoverished because the main breadwinners have been disabled by industry. So you can see again this sort of sense of the worker here as a broken hand, as somebody who is whose body is damaged by the work that they're doing. There's a fascinating history actually to the genesis of these organized marches that we were probably most familiar with, the Jarrow Hunger March, which became, well, with several marches and became iconic. But these mass marches were pioneered, in fact, in 1920 by the National League of the Blind. The first Hunger March wasn't organized by the TUC until a couple of years later. And disability was itself a major concern of these marches, as I've tried to explain already. So disability issues were often foregrounded on those protest marches, as we saw in the previous slide with pneumoconiosis, the deadly dust. The men marching there are representing those who are too disabled to march. Okay, so I want to move on now to look in a bit more detail at a couple of passages from this novel, Sorrow from Thy Sons, which is written by Gwyn Thomas in around 1936, so in the middle of the Depression of the 30s, but it wasn't published until 1986. It was rejected by a publisher as being too grim, basically. And it's interesting that it appears in 1986, which is just after those disastrous miners' strikes of 84, 85, when the pits are being closed. So I want to look at this literature to explain the importance or the relationship between mutualism and disability, and to highlight the way that this novel actually anticipates some concepts that would be developed later on by disability theorists. So I'm going to just read from a few paragraphs from the novel. We'll look at this passage together, and then we'll analyze it a bit. This passage comes at the end of the novel, near the end of the novel, and there is a huge march happening in the valley, one of the many large protest marches. The people in front of Hugh and Alf began to move. The brothers fell into step. That was not an easy job. 3 of the 4 men in the rank in front of them walked with a limp. It was hard to say which leg they were going to put forward next. Hugh stopped for a moment and looked back. Their own contingent was 6,000 or 7,000 strong. It stretched too far back around too many corners to be seen as a whole. A young boy, the son of one of the limping men, walked by Alf's side, playing a harmonica as broad as his face. The boy had a loose, undisciplined mouth and dribbled a good deal, but the music he produced was sprightly. He worked on 3 tunes, a Welsh folk song reset to a rhythm basis, a tune of the American Civil War, and an anthem of the International Class War. At intervals, the boy's father turned round with a handkerchief in his hand and wiped the boy's mouth. Hugh looked once more at the vast body of demonstrators who were advancing down the mountain road half a mile away. It's significant, he said. Watching this is like listening to great music, only greater, much greater. Wonderful people. When they can come onto the streets at a few days' notice with ranks as firm and solid as these, there's nothing they can't achieve. 50,000 oppressed banding together against a common injury. Strong faces, strong bodies marching, strong voices singing, strong wills, strong arms to snatch us out of our dirty, brooding, fornicating little closets and plant us up on high, where the air is clear and worth drinking. From a point like this, life's immediate purposes seem so far away as to look like straight, simple lines without a twist or break in any part of it. I feel like an eagle. Speak quieter. If the police hear you talking like that, I'll spend tonight bailing you out. Silence, except for the sound of feet and the boy's harmonica. Hugh noted that a lot of feet made sloppy sound as they reached the floor, as if their souls were leaving the uppers. Okay, so I want to look at the language and the imagery of this important passage. Particularly the fact that a lot of the imagery is reliant on the language of embodiment. Specifically, there's a contrast made between the imagery of crooked, asymmetrical and undisciplined bodies and the strong, unbroken ranks of the march, which, as Hugh articulates it, we're seeing this largely through Hugh's description. So we can't actually be confident that this is, if you like, the authorial or the authoritative perspective. And there is an ironic clash between the two visions, which I think is used between this idea of the crooked and the straight and strong. There's an ironic clash between these two visions of embodiment, which is used to make several different but related arguments about the workers and about disability and solidarity. So Hugh's eagle perspective sees the people become a single vast body made of firm and, these are his words, firm and solid ranks. And it's this body, the body of men, constructed via a military image of power, of discipline and uniformity. I mean, Hugh's speech relies on the repetition of the words strong, strong faces, strong bodies marching, strong voices singing, strong wills, strong arms. Strong is repeated so often it almost becomes absurd, where our attention is drawn to it. And this imagery of muscular strength supporting the sort of a strength of resolution, strong will, recalls a kind of fascist rhetoric of the 1930s, and also specifically the state-sanctioned Great German Art of 1937, which refuses variation by embracing an idea of human form characterized by exaggerated perfection and striking regularity. So I would like to suggest that through the prism of the Great German Art of the period, perhaps, or in comparison with that, we can see that the trajectory of Hugh's rhetoric is similarly towards the perfect, the pure, and the regular. And he specifically talks about getting away from the dirty, brooding, fornicating life in little closets of the town up to the high, clear air. And Hugh sees life's immediate purposes resolved into a straight, simple line without a twist or break in any part of it. So we have the purity of an unbroken, untwisted line, which again draws our attention to the contrast between bodily perfection, which is the similes and the metaphors of the imagery of Hugh's representation of this body of men, and that the contrast with the imperfect, twisted, broken and impaired bodies of the miners that we meet at the beginning of the march. So the collective is, at least rhetorically, constructed as strong and regular and whole. So I mentioned the great German art, and I should just say a little bit about it briefly before returning to Gwyn Thomas. So in Germany in 1937, there were two exhibitions which ran side by side. One was entitled The Great German Art, which was, as I said, about these sort of perfected, idealized bodies, and degenerate art, which was so-called degenerate art, which was modernist and actually considerably well, has stood the test of time, sort of modernist art, but was described as degenerate art, and in fact almost allowed to run in order for the Nazis to make a point about degeneracy and about the imperfect body. This modernist work had earlier in 1928 been specifically compared with disability, and condemned for celebrating so-called deformity. Now, I'm suggesting that Gwyn Thomas is using a similar contrast between the regular and the deformed or disabled, not because I'm suggesting he's endorsing the Nazi view. Far from it, as we shall see if we look at in detail at his limping men. If we come down from Hugh's soaring heights to a close-up view of the men with which this marching scene begins, the marching ranks are in fact made up of limping men who are perpetually out of step. As individuals, the people are dribbling, they're hobbling, they're so poorly shod as to make them walk with difficulty. And, you know, on one level, poverty is what is disabling here. And you can see from the quote on the slide, which comes from the end of that extract, but Hugh noticed that a lot of feet made sloppy sounds as they reached the floor, as if their souls were leaving the uppers. The breaking shoes are what make some of the men walk unevenly, and we've also got that the homonym, the souls leaving the uppers, the idea of the soul departing potentially because of the extreme poverty, which the men are marching against. So, or for all the idea of the strong bodies of straight lines of men, actually the individuals are anything but straight and perfected. And now I want to look at the young boy that we met at the start, the one who's making the music. If we look at that young boy, we see a figure who is impaired, but not apparently disabled. We remember the distinction between impairment and disability. Impairment is the kind of physical condition, and disability is the social manifestation of that impairment. This boy is a figure who invites us to consider the idea of interdependence. I said at the beginning that dependency was almost universally aligned with disability. Well, let's think about interdependence and interdependency, and think about the way that that is linked in this extract to community solidarity. So, against the contrast set up by Thomas the contrast set up by Thomas in this passage, again, they offer us a way in. So you've got this quasi-military discipline of the vast body of men, which is aligned with individual bodily discipline. But this is undone by the loose, undisciplined mouth of the boy who dribbles. So the boy's body is undisciplined. Disability is often constructed as a failure to control the body, by which measure the uncontrolled, undisciplined mouth is a disability. Although Susan Wendell, who makes this observation in The Rejected Body, also points out that the disabled body actually exposes the mythical nature of control over the body. But say the undisciplined body is culturally aligned with disability. How does that make us view the boy? As I said, in this scene, the boy is not disabled by his undisciplined mouth. Rather, he is routinely cared for by another marcher, his father. even more importantly, the boy performs culturally and politically significant tunes which unify the marchers as Welsh. There's a Welsh folk song there. As fighting for civil rights as part of an international socialist movement, and again connected with the American Civil War, another uprising over rights. So this passage, I'm arguing, draws into question the high-flown imagery of bodily perfection, which has been espoused by Hugh in his sort of propagandist version of the power of unity and organized political action. But in contrast to Hugh's strong bodies, the humorous picture of out-of-step marchers and the dribbling boy cared for by his limping father is an unsentimental and much warmer and more convincing portrayal of community solidarity. And it's also one that challenges or blurs the lines between conventional binaries of disabled or able-bodied or disabled and normal. It blurs the boundaries between carer and recipient of care. And thus I think it introduces us or suggests the idea of interdependence. As well as having an impairment, the limping man is a carer looking after the dribbling boy. Remember that at intervals, the boy's father turned around with a handkerchief in his hand and wiped the boy's mouth. But the boy is not only dependent on the man's care, he is the musician who sets the pace with his rhythmic music and brings the crowd together. He has an important social and political function. So against the assumption of the disabled individual isolated and rendered miserable by their lack of independence, disability theory has come to stress the dependency or the interdependency of us all. For many able-bodied persons, disability, as I said earlier on, is synonymous with dependency. And that's framed as a condition of kind of tragic limit and loss, requiring regimes of care and rehabilitation. So disability is horrifying because of its lack of independence. For disability activists who have fought long and hard to achieve a degree of autonomy, dependency for them too conjures up the spectre of paternalism that has historically marked living with a physical or cognitive impairment. So there are groups within who might describe themselves as disabled, who are also resistant to the idea of dependency. But Leonard Davis, in the quote on the slide, argues that if we redefine our notions of independence to acknowledge, to include the vast networks of assistance and provision that make modern life possible, cars, heating, glazing, computers, Zoom, whatever you want to add to this, no one can live without being dependent on these. Then, once you acknowledge that, then the seeming state of exception of disability turns out to be the unexceptional state of existence. That is, once we acknowledge that we are all dependent, then the idea of disability as linked with dependency becomes questionable or universal, perhaps. This is an unexceptional state of existence. We are all dependent. So again, once we return disability to its social context and stop treating it as an individual failure or as a medical problem, as the social model of disability proposes, we recognize that much disablement is social in its origin. And once we focus on social interactions which are disabling or enabling, we also see that all people are enabled or disabled by a complex network of social and material relations. So Caulfield's literature foregrounds themes of interdependency, and community solidarity is a form of interdependence, a form of recognizing our mutual dependence. And it's also becomes a source of pride. You will never see a miner refuse to help another who was sick or injured, for it may be his own turn next, claims Bert Coombs in These Poor Hands. So we could think about the idea of this strong body of the collective that Hugh talks about, that perhaps it's not, after all, necessarily in conflict with the images of the impaired bodies which make up the procession, although the imagery has clearly contrasted the strong straight lines and the undisciplined and limping and irregular men bodies. Those are in contrast, but actually ideologically we may recognize that it's actually the marching people's daily acts of mutual care and a recognition of that interdependence which comprise that solidarity and which brings them strength as a collective body. Thomas's marchers find the power in communal action, banding together against common injury, as he puts it. And this phrase suggests power and possibly healing through an inclusive unity and interdependence. The power of a body of marchers made up of individually impaired but interdependent people invites the imagination of a new kind of body politic. And Gwyn Thomas and other Welsh writers focus on impairment and disability and mutualism to propose in their literature a different form of embodied citizenship, one that allows for variation, but one that is modelled on mutual support and interdependence. I won't read through this slide, but it offers a kind of a functional sense of what interdependency means in terms of, and how it is distinct from and related to independence and dependence. If you're interested in any of the discussion that I've offered or the analysis of Gwyn Thomas that I've offered here, then you can read more in this book, Disability in Industrial Britain, which is available from Manchester Open Hive for free. You can download the entire book. And in this book, we argue, as I have implied here, but I've only really scratched the surface, that, that what we learn from understanding disability has wider ramifications for the way that we behave in the future as citizens and as a nation. And this book analyses sort of case studies from 3 coalfields in Britain, and as I've tried to give you a taste, uses literature in part to understand the historical experience of disability and the way that it impacted change in those communities.